Hello, my name is Duel, and welcome to my preliminary Huntsman Altamore guide. This guide is intended to be as accurate as possible prior to the release of Castle Nathria raid. However, as the raid is not yet live, some of the information in this guide may be slightly inaccurate. Despite this, I believe this guide will provide you with an effective strategy for dealing with the Huntsman. Huntsman Altamore is the second of 10 bosses of the Castle Nathria raid. It is a 4-phase encounter. There are 4 bosses in this encounter. There's Altamore and his 3 pets, and they are Margor, Barghast, and Hecutus. You will face Altamore during all 4 phases, and each of his pets sequentially in the first, second, and third phases. In the 4th phase, you will be left with just Altamore. Both Altamore and his pets have 2 abilities. You will have to deal with both Altamore's abilities and the abilities of his pets simultaneously. The combinations of abilities would dictate how mechanics should be managed. Looking at the boss room, the boss should be tanked here in the centre, with tanks positioned here, melee spread here, and ranged spread here. We will first look at Altamore. Altamore's first ability is Sin Seeker. This ability targets several players in the raid with a debuff, and after a short amount of time, a wide projectile will move towards and through the target, doing damage and applying a dot to all players caught in its path. This projectile affects not only players caught between the boss and the target, but all players behind the target. The way this is managed is melee stand on one side of the boss, whilst ranged stand on the other side, with everyone in the raid loosely spread. This is done for the benefit of melee, as it is harder to see where the ranged are positioned behind them, and we don't want to affect them. Ranged players should be further away from the boss, so we'll have less difficulty dodging another player's Sin Seeker. The targeted ranged player should remain still whilst other players make sure they aren't between or behind it when it goes off. Melee manage things differently, as they are closer to the boss and more likely to be clipped by the ability. Allocate one half of melee, preferably the side further from the wall, for Sin Seeker and the other half for without. Affected melee should move to the area, ensuring they aren't overlapping, whilst unaffected melee move to the other side to avoid being hit. Return to the spread after Sin Seeker is cast. After Sin Seeker goes off, players should return to an even spread around the boss because of Altamore's second ability, Spread Shot. Spread Shot is an instant cast cone, dealing direct damage to all players in the area with an unlimited range. It hits fairly hard, so to mitigate some of the damage, all players should be loosely but evenly spread around the boss. Now we will talk about Altamore's pets. Altamore has an ability called Huntsman's Bond, which duplicates any damage done to Altamore to his pet, and vice versa. It also has a stacking debuff, stacking every time one of his pets dies. This debuff increases the damage Altamore takes by 100%. Thus, every time a pet dies, he will take double, triple, and eventually quadruple damage. This ability changes how you should select targets throughout the fight, as at early points in the fight it is better to just cleave both targets, whilst at other times it may be better to single target Altamore. It will also depend on whether the increased damage Altamore takes as his pets die is also transferred to his following pets. Altamore's first pet is called Margor. The first ability the raid has to worry about is Vicious Lunge. Vicious Lunge targets a player, and after a short time charges to him, dealing an otherwise lethal amount of damage shared amongst all players in 6 yards. The typical way of managing this is for 4 or so players to stand within this area before the charge occurs to spread the damage and making it survivable. Alternatively, if a player that has an immunity is targeted with this ability, they can use this so other players don't have to soak with them. Just be careful if you do this not to stand on top of other players, as they will still receive damage and will probably be one-shot. It is important to remember at this time that Altamore will still be using his abilities, so players who get targeted with Sin Seeker should not be participating in the soak, and should be nowhere near the player soon to be charged. It is also important to remember Spread Shot, and if players remain clustered after stacking to soak the charge, they will receive an unnecessary amount of damage, so be sure to spread out again after the charge occurs. This is a general rule throughout the fight. The other mechanic Margor does is Jagged Claws. This is the tank mechanic for Phase 1. Tanks will receive a stacking debuff that does direct damage initially and damage over time, lasting 30 seconds. It is unsure how frequently Margor uses this mechanic, and the amount of stacks required before a taunt swap occurs will depend on how frequently the ability is used. What you'll want to do on live is pay attention to the time between applications, and the amount of stacks you swap at will depend on how frequently things are applied according to this table. However many times it is used in 30 seconds is the amount you should taunt swap at. Any less and you won't be able to drop stacks of the debuff off, and it will become unmanageable. Tanks should save mitigation for when stacks get highest, as the bleed eventually hurts far more than the direct damage. They will also need heavy heals as they taunt swap and continue to bleed. As Margor is about to die, Barghast will enter starting phase 2. His first ability is Shades of Barghast, which will regularly spawn adds around the room that attempt to cast Deathly Roar, which if cast, will do heavy damage and apply a pretty much lethal dot. Players must CC these adds in order to prevent them from completing their cast. In addition, when these adds are CC'd, they gain a stack of the debuff, Destabilize, that increases their damage taken by 100%, making them much easier to kill as stacks accumulate. However, they are also gradually gaining a resource bar, which at 100 energy will prevent them from being CC'd, meaning nothing is stopping them from completing their cast. The way you should deal with this is to have your raids spam CC on these adds until enough stacks are accumulated such that they can be rapidly killed, but not accumulating so many stacks that you waste time and they reach 100 energy. It's hard to know the exact number of stacks that's ideal, and eventually there will be a point of diminishing returns, but experiment for yourself. 30 or so should be sufficient. The second ability is Rip Soul, which is another tank mechanic. When tanks are struck by Barghast, an ad will spawn that has starting health proportional to the tank's health when struck. This ad will walk towards Altamore until it is fully healed, at which point it will despawn. If it reaches Altamore, Altamore will receive a 200% damage buff, and it's essentially a wipe. Tanks should separate Altamore and Barghast at this phase in order to increase the distance between the ad that spawns and Altamore. Tanks should be fully topped before this ability is cast, with active mitigation and any shields that can be applied. If the tank starts at a high health, the ad will need less healing and will be less likely to reach the boss. But if you're still struggling and you need more time to heal the ad, you can kite Altamore across the room away from the ad. In the third phase, you will be dealing with Hecutus. For this phase, you will want to reposition the raid near one of the walls, and as the phase progresses, drag him across the room in a staggered fashion. You should lust in this phase once the boss is repositioned. This is to take full advantage of the 200% damage taken buff, which if you target Altamore, should also transfer to Hecutus. His two abilities are Petrifying Howl and Crushing Stone. Hecutus' first ability is Petrifying Howl, which applies a debuff to several players that slows and does damage. When this debuff expires, minor damage is done to all players in 10 yards, and a large pool will be left on the ground that does ticking damage and slows anybody stood in it. Players who receive this debuff should stand near the wall for the first lot of debuffs, overlapping the area as much as possible, returning to the fight when it expires. Subsequent debuffs should be dropped on the edge of previous pools. As space is occupied by the pools, the boss should be moved across the room so that pools are avoided but the raid is still near enough to drop subsequent pools. At this time, Altamore will be using Sin Seeker. It is recommended that melee use this space to direct Sin Seeker, and ranged use this space. This avoids any possible collateral hits as players are dropping pools. Remember to return to the spread after every pool is dropped because you want to mitigate spread shot. The other mechanic is Crushing Stone. Every time Hecutus auto-attacks, it gains a stack of the buff. This buff increases his damage done by 25% and reduces his speed. Whenever it moves, it will lose a stack and do moderate raid-wide damage, and when it is not being tanked, it will charge towards its target. The boss will be moved throughout the fight as pools are avoided, but it will probably need to be moved on top of that anyway. Tanks need to strike a balance between moving the boss about to keep stacks low and surviving, and whilst not dropping too many stacks in quick succession or when the raid is low from other damage. And in the final phase when Hecutus dies, you will only have Altamore to deal with. At this point, he will be taking the most damage and have the fewest mechanics. This will be the easiest part of the fight if you still have plenty of space from the last phase. And that's the fight. If you found this guide helpful, there are more like it on the way. I plan to release a new video every day, and maybe even 2 on one day in the lead up to the raid, so look out for those. If you found this guide to be helpful, please like, comment, subscribe, all that. Share it with your guildies. If you were to share the guides in your discords, that'd be great. Also, if you're interested in raiding and from the OCE servers, our guild's always recruiting. So if you're interested, please shoot Emphatic on Bartholus a message, or send him some in-game mail, he'll get back to you. But other than that, yeah, my name's Duel, that's it from me, so hope this has been helpful, and good luck in the raid.